All right, again, thank you very much for tuning in, and welcome to Size of Thoughts, Conversations with the Alliance of History Graduate Students. My name is Jacob Glicklick. I'm a graduate student in history, and I'm the producer for the show. The things that you're going to hear over the next hour represent the views of Size of Thoughts and the people making them. Therefore, those opinions, conversations, and quotations do not in any way represent River West Radio. The persons responsible are solely the producer, guests, and people calling in. Consequently, River West Radio, lest there be any confusion, is not liable for any legal issues arising from the content that you're about to hear. So, again, this is the second episode, thanks to both those of you that are joining us for the first time and those that are coming back after our premiere last week. I am the host, Jacob, and I am joined once again by guests Randy Miller.
Hi, Jacob.
Hey, Randy. And Monica Drake.
Hi, Jacob. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here, both of you. So, we've talked about a lot of interesting things last week, and I think one of the ones most struck me was the discussion in the context of activism in history, where Randy made the point that just felt that his experience of teaching Iraq War became, very different at different points in the Iraq War. I mean, I think that, raises what can perhaps be our first question for this is, at what point does, how far away to events do we have to be as historians to treat them as historians? Or to put it more melodramatically, when does history begin? When does it stop being, living memory or newsworthy and become something that, feel we have enough objectivity, detachment to talk about?
So does it become history when it ceases to become a current event? How do we define that?
Not sure. I guess it seems that there's an assumption that history, as opposed to current events, are something that just we are less involved in, that we can see, in their totality.
Well, I think I'm going to defer to Hegel, the classic Owl of Minerva takes flight at night. The meaning being, we really don't understand a particular era until it's over, until we can actually look back on it and see something forming, so that we're aware that something has happened, a period or event or something like that. So based on that, there's really nothing you can put a finger on. It's just at some point we understand it as history. We understand it as having enough study behind it, enough historiography produced. The journalists have had at it. They have done their thing. And the historians are starting to get at it. It's a tough one.
Make it sound a little like vultures, that after any given journalistic event or there's run through with current events of it, then the historians swoop once it's, removed enough or, not controversial enough to then, be dissect and analyze it. I don't know. I guess with in regards to the Iraq War, is that something that now you would feel comfortable teaching in entire years?
Well, put it this way: if there were a book, history of the Iraq War, I wouldn't buy it. It's too soon for me.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's merit in having some objectivity in what you're talking about, and I think that. As far as the Iraq War, I think the consensus hasn't been made on really what it meant and what it will mean for the future, for our future, for our American future or the world. Of course, there is a use in contemporary journalism. They do their part in getting the frontline story and creating, maybe not creating, but gleaning personal perspectives and maybe organizing some kind of oral history from people who are, involved in that historians can use later to create an understanding about the event later on. But I agree with Randy. I agree with Jacob. I think there needs to be some objectivity in creating the historical framework for an event.
We can refer to also the quotation. I don't remember who said it, but it was 150 years after the French Revolution, and they were asked, "What does it mean?" And the answer was, "It's too early to tell."
Yeah, I think that's often attributed to Mao Zedong. As of course, where else would one learn context and objectivity than Mao? Yeah, but also I guess there does seem to be a trade-off with that. That if we are focusing or not applying ourselves as historians, we can obviously apply our perspective in lots of other ways that don't make the same claim, but not to things that we have clear sighting on. We do remove ourselves from kind of public arena. To take, again, Iraq War as a context, most, I think, practicing historians, in 2002, 2003 were, far more critical and, opposed to the conflict than in terms of the American public or at large.
And this might have a lot to do with how we delineate the disciplines. We're not journalists, technically. We're not pundits. We're not political scientists. So that if it's something that can be used as for material for punditry or for political science, for making political marks, and however you want to do it, it's sort of outside of the realm of the historian, correct? We're not supposed to be doing that. So I think the Iraq War is still so, it technically is still going on. There hasn't been a clear end to it yet. That'll be a big question. When did it end? When will it end?
Assuming it ends. So
yeah,
that's something for our grandchildren to work out when possibly. That's even in the context of U.S. involvement and stakes and military pressure. I don't think that's by any means ended.
But I think that's a great point too, because for me, the way I see myself as a historian, I really understand my job as analyzing and interpreting, and in that I find, or I would define it as analyzing and interpreting something that had some finality to it, in order to produce something that made sense. And I think that would be my contribution to the historiography on any kind of event or situation in the past that I think would be able to really have some kind of backing behind it.
But I think Jacob is getting at something important. Even though I wouldn't be comfortable with a book on the Iraq War written coming out next week, at the same time, the historian does have a role here in contextualizing everything. Why is it some people were so against the war from the beginning? There was a certain context that was not very much a part of political debate. But to get any sort of meaning out of it, you would have to ask a historian. You would have to ask someone who at least would be familiar with the periphery of what's going on with it.
Yeah, I tend to be a little, more skeptical about the focus on finality, because it seems that risks prioritizing a study of in terms of dead things, or if we're seeing that the things that historians are best equipped to do, which in some ways we are, is things that are have a relatively clear endpoint, conclusion, successor, and even if they still impact the present, they no longer resonate with it as much. Which is to say, things that aren't as relevant, aren't as connected, aren't as crucial to understand. And again, with Iraq, if you see that in the context of earlier continuities, if simply do not approach it as this new, tentative, extraordinary thing happening, which we're not sure where it will end, but see it as the 18th European or a European descendant invasion of Middle East and another context of empire. That's something that even without claiming to have crystal ball into the future, you could make a number of fairly accurate predictions and I think have a better structural understanding. That's the other paradox. We talked a lot last week about the right and the nationalist view of history, but what's most ironic, I think, about conservatives is how a lot of their political standpoint depends on erasing connection with the past, of erasing any sense of things happening, prior to the direct moment. So hence again, September 11th becomes this out of the blue. Don't want to talk about the U.S. presence in the Middle East or the CIA backing for al-Qaeda in the 80s. Don't want to talk about the Iraq War in the context of, strategic imperialism and access to oil revenue.
Yeah, I don't know if I don't think it's so much as cutting themselves off from the past. I think there has been a very, very sophisticated attempt, and not to sound conspiratorial, but it's definitely part of the discourse on the right, and by the right I mean the far right, where you have a mixture of politics and religion. They have created their own narrative, their own meta narrative, in which all things can be put in made sense of. Why did they bomb us? Well, because we're awesome and they're jealous of us. We have freedom, they don't. We're rich, they're not. Of course, we would never do anything incorrectly with our foreign policy. We would never oppress a people, or we would never bomb innocent people. That's just not possible. And I think we see this narrative at work quite a bit. The distrust of experts, the distrust of us as historians who have gone to universities, in favor of people like Glenn Beck or Sean Hannity, who say almost nothing that's true.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, particularly since the anti-intellectualism of the modern right is perversely one of its most pseudo-populist and dangerous venues. While they're about championing openly hierarchical and authoritarian policies, they can seize this kind of radical leveling aspirations. This we don't need any in terms of fancy East Coast liberals to come in and throw in a lot of white guilt about the past. I don't need these experts or historians to do it. I know that this country is great. I mean, that sounds almost like I'm sort of parodying or exaggerating, but also at the same time would be a stump speech for I think a lot of people on the right, that it's a way of championing and lauding as heroic.
And they've been given what I like to call a liberal veto. If there's uncomfortable information, you stamp it as coming from a liberal point of view, and therefore you don't have to take it seriously. It's corrupt. Liberals are corrupt. Their education is corrupt. They don't like America. They don't like God. Whatever.
I think that even the assumption of corruption has some element of truth. I mean, at least insofar as we're. Well, I mean, for all of us at a public university, that ultimately we have the students in our classrooms that are doing it not because they're thrilled to be learning these interesting things that are presenting them. I mean, hopefully some of them are, but more broadly because it's something that we're threatening them with the possibility of poor grades if they do not appear and give at least some reasonable attempts to be attentive. And furthermore, we can bribe them with effective grades if they appear to learn. I mean, we are expecting them to mimic us. I mean, it seems that no matter what specific politics comes from it, I mean, the danger if we don't make a democratic, participatory environment is that we're still using a amount of coercion towards them. We're still using kind of space to incomplicitly with, at least the state governance, which I think is extremely problematic.
So Glenn Beck is right. The academics are fascists.
I mean, is the control of within the classroom, is that a democratic space? I mean, do you think of it? Should it be? I think it's at least authoritarian most of the time.
I don't think it's authoritarian. And I don't think it's necessarily democratic. I think certainly the professor, the teacher, whomever, has control of the space, but they can give up as much as they want. I think the key is that students are intrinsically motivated, that there's a permissiveness. There has to be an order, but that doesn't mean there can't be permissiveness of thought, of expression. If you go that route, you end up having to say that anytime you have to learn a fact or a thing, there's something totalitarian about it because it's something you have to take in, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, I don't think that in practice, sometimes, your teaching style might devolve into a more authoritarian way of disseminating knowledge. But I don't think that there are many people who would say that they want their classroom to be completely authoritarian and that they would like to jam ideas down the throats of students. I think for me, personally, sometimes the classes that I do teach kind of devolve into that, where I'm writing down facts that they should write down and that they will regurgitate on their exam. But ultimately, I would love it if I had enough time, or I felt like they had a historical framework where we could become more creative in what we were talking about, or analyze sources more, or maybe talk about how to think critically with respect to certain historical events. So I think for me, it's not, that they ultimately are, it's that logistically sometimes they just become that.
And similarly, because of logistics, I mean, the thing that we've talked about, like, there's so much potential information to be made, there's so much that needs to get left out inevitably, that's I mean, I'd say that insofar as we're controlling what gets presented or talked about or made, sort of the field of class, and what just sort of isn't, that seems a pretty centralized model. I mean, I think that education, it runs through as a number of authoritarian assumptions that with the provisions of, in terms of whether our presumed expertise or at least greater insight or knowledge of something allows us to set up how the field of discourse plays out, what gets said, what's not. I mean, we might exercise that in different ways. I think more effective of us isn't in a rigid, controlling, extremely supervised manner, but in one that does, give more room for exchange. But it's, at the end of the day, I mean, if any of us wanted in discussion sections to cramp down and to have certain students or all students, to shut up and listen to us, we could. We might be more, somewhat lenient authoritarians or not exercise some aspects of the power as much. But I do think it's not. I mean, it's not an equal playing field.
Well, if a teacher of history at the college level is presenting nothing but facts, they're doing something very, very wrong. The material of history, the narrative, we should always be striving for engaging with it, whether it's trying to think through the problems that the people at that time that were studying were thinking through. What were they up against? What were they doing? Why were they doing it? Getting into trying to get into a mentality. Ultimately, we model. We model to the student at the college level. We're modeling what to do with this kind of information. We're modeling how to think through it, how it can be useful to us, how we can ascribe meaning to it, how it can help us. So I think phrasing the problem like that, I think leaves out so much of what we do and at the college level, because there is so much more to the narrative of history than a simple narrative and a simple set of facts.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. We should definitely be looking into, giving people the tools in order to understand what history is all about, and that really boils down to defining, what history is. And like I said before, for me, it's analyzing information and interpreting that information. So whether or not that's, that I have to interpret scientific data or social sciences, the data from social sciences, or whatever it is that I have to analyze, I then have to interpret that. My own bias goes into that interpretation. However, I think that's the difference, and we can kind of flip-flop our first question. Instead of, when does news become history, it's almost reversed into the fact of when does history become news. The Glenn Becks of the world have decided to turn a national mythology into our history. And so students come into our classrooms not having any basis or understanding of those tools that they need to really wade through the Glenn Becks.
Yeah. But even putting that in that way, does presume that even while history is supposed to be developing interpretation and further insight and empowerment and understanding of the past, we're also presuming a very unequal field of approach. We're assuming that sort of students, in terms of are ignorant, or not even just in terms of not knowing facts, but are not, as being as sort of capable of researching the past or approaching it correctly, so that in some way that our obligation is to then shape them,
But they can think through, and perhaps this is more about pedagogy than it is an explanation of what history is. But for example, if you're teaching ancient Greece, the student should be investigating and discussing Plato's cave. They should be discussing the ideas that are going throughout the culture. If they're learning about the French Revolution, they should be reading Rousseau and trying to figure out what Rousseau was trying to get at. What was he saying? What were the problems? What was the problems with the ancient regime? What's it going ahead? What were the revolutionaries thinking in all the French revolutions? So allowing the students to debate those questions, there always has to be an element of intellectual history there. There has to be a mentality. There has to be a way of engaging the material in that way. Otherwise, it gets dry.
Yeah, and I'm not so postmodern as to, throw out the context or the framework that is, needed to have a good discussion. I mean, if we're doing that, would be in English department probably rather than history. But I guess I'm just slightly wary, and even trying to be increasingly self-critical in terms of the way that that's presented. I mean, even for itself, or in terms of more broadly in the profession of what makes for real and connection of it. And I think part of
it does assume something that I know you're quite critical of, and that is that people at Rousseau's time are experiencing the same things that we're experiencing. That there's some sort of vague human nature that allows us to at least get in their heads in some way.
Yeah, I mean,
well, it also presumes that they care, and the way that our educational system is structured. These are some of the courses that they have to take are required courses that they couldn't care less about. I think for me, in order to really think critically or read Rousseau critically, I'd have to be pretty concerned about what was going on. I mean, not just from a standpoint of getting a good grade, but intimately wanting to know and understand the material.
Yeah, and I think because a lot of the setup of what we go into it does presume so much that by virtue of being graduate students, we are in terms of the experts on it, which is not invariably the case. That it's useful as an exercise in, I think, humility and in having a real relationship and connection with the students, as opposed to just going through particular presentation of material, or even a specific mechanistic presentation of the learning skills, analyzing primary sources, et cetera, that need to do, is instead, connecting to the common ground, which I guess sort of loops back to things we were talking about in terms of within activism and within the value of presenting oneself in relation to the modern world. Not because they are so sure and so confident and so, inspired with sort of evangelical-like political enthusiasm that have to try to, bring everyone else into being, anarchists as well, though there's some element of that. But more broadly, because we're not certain, because I don't actually know what's going to happen next week, what's actually happening now, because it brings in this kind of, fuzzy, vulnerable lack of confidence that is the modern world. And I also, just think the value of presenting oneself as teachers, not as this sort of distant, impartial, separate entity, or authoritarian, or even just the authority broadly, but as a worker that has the particular conditions, which become vulnerable and jeopardized.
You can tell the difference in the very, very old professors and the very, very young professors, that they have a completely different understanding and relationship to teaching.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. There's far more of that, what you were calling authoritarian, lack of engagement, lack of personal engagement, as you find with the more pedagogically astute younger professors that are coming up. Professor Chu is pedagogically sophisticated. He knows how to present material.
Yeah, and and one way or another, it has to be about engaging with the students, which means I think meeting them, where they're at, which means understanding what they know or think they know, which I think goes back to like the question of like teaching about like the myths or things that people think they know about a particular conflict, or relating, or at least being aware of in terms of what pop culture says about a particular thing of history, and then trying to push through that, but push with it. I mean, I'm not proposing a model of spending 30 out of every 50 minutes, engaging in general chit chat or non-general things of it as a way of connecting
as a way of
connecting with students. But yeah, I do think some measure of relating to pressing current values.
Well, you can present yourself as open and interested, not don't put a wall up between yourself and the students. You can, whether you're like that in real life, it doesn't matter. You can learn to pretend, and you can be open, and students will pick up on that. They will see that you love the material, that you're interested in them doing well, and that you're interested in doing a good job. So, I mean,
well, I also think that, at a certain time, 20, 30 years out from a particular historical situation is enough time to maybe have some finality, have a lot of sources, a historiography behind something, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't, with current topics or current events, bring those up within the classroom, because I think there are a lot of people, who publish small snippets of history on larger events in academic journals or dissertations that are just as useful and are just as important for students to be looking at than those materials that you get 20 or 30 years out, because it really shows an early historical process. This is what somebody thought about. For example, let's take the Iraq War again in 2004, and now in 2012, here's somebody else writing about the same event. More sources have come to light, and now this is what people are thinking about the Iraq War.
And I guess the other thing, just specific to that issues and others of them, is we can't unfortunately leave too much to the media, because media is doing a terrible job. I mean, in a better situation of things, there would if there was some degree of not a non-corporate news making that actually kept people relatively informed with the more pertinent issues of the modern world, we could assume a lot more and simply build off those connections. But
right,
quite commonly,
and the media is not directed by the same ethics that historians are. So with what Randy was saying before, it is not it's not their job, maybe as much as it is our job to be diligent in gathering those sources, analyzing them, and interpreting them, as I said before. I don't think Glenn Beck thinks he has any ethical obligation to his listeners as far as what he says. So that might be the difference.
Yeah, we can. I guess. Yeah. I wonder if how much of the show will be like a psychoanalyzing of Glenn Beck.
Unless he's a real sociopath and he just doesn't. Yeah. He just
psychoanalysis on the Glenn Becks or the larger impact of him. But yeah, and I think that generally like 20 years or so of it becomes a reasonable benchmark. But also that some cases that becomes extremely fluid. I mean, I think there's students now who are not aware of the politically, historically significant, big scale impact things that happened a year ago. That if this and a similar token might be deeply much more aware or in touch with things that are outside their actual what should be their awareness or zone of empathy or things of connection. I mean, Chicago a couple weeks ago, there was a lot of people going like, remember murder of Fred Hampton, remember the police repression in '68. I mean, these are largely 20-something kids that are doing this, but I don't think it was sort of like just a facile reference of it. I think that there are the possibility of certain connections and continuities that make the job of like finding some larger insight into the past and having an understanding of the connection to the present a lot easier.
Isn't that their own version of Whig history? I mean, every political persuasion, every ism will interpret the past to justify what they're doing. It's just the way it is. You have to get history on your side. They're all throughout the 19th century in France, all the isms, in order to be taken seriously, you had to tie your view of the world to the French Revolution. Either the French Revolution was all about this coming into being, or if you were a conservative, the French Revolution was punishment from God for not following the church. If you were a socialist, the French Revolution was about fraternity and socialism. If you were a liberal, it was about liberalism. If you were a romantic, it was something indefinable. But nonetheless. So,
Yeah,
I mean, I'm a little bit leery about, they're historically informed, but are they historically informed, or are they just have picked a few things out that makes them justifies what they're doing?
Well, I mean, I would certainly agree that any movement or cause needs to have a narrative of the past. I disagree that it would always be a Whig narrative, or that it would necessarily be equally facile. I mean, I think that, among other things, if you're defining yourself in a view of the past that's much more oppositional to that quote, that's much more challenging, that's much more, at least, a revolutionary or views, prospects of revolution as a good thing, that usually requires looking at things more structurally than the typical nationalist narrative. It needs to have a more global historical view of where you think particular groups got it the most wrong or got it closest to being right. If nothing else, it does. I mean, set up a different set of a different timeline.
Our view of the United States usually fits our usually fits how our present politics usually colors how we see our past.
Always, I'd say.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't. A conservative will have a conservative view, a conservative narrative of American history, essentially a Whig interpretation. I think someone who's a radical will have a radical version of it, more of a. They're more likely to read Howard Zinn's book than not. So, I don't know. I'm wondering.
It's always easy to exist in places where you don't have to defend what you're thinking or saying, politically or socially. It's always easy to exist in, a blanket of national mythology, and obviously the Glenn Becks or the Rush Limbaughs of the world on the right, they have created, their news media suffices. I don't think that many people, the far right, who listen to them feel like they need to look outside to understand what happened in the past, to feel comfortable that they're right. I don't want to just attack the far right either. That can be said for the far left as well.
Although, yeah, it has less power overall, so I feel less. I would feel, in terms of at least sorrier for them in some of the links. But I mean, it's possible in any case to have a certain belief circle. I mean, the internet has made that easier. That goes into a particular range that simply doesn't lead anywhere. It's just a circular curve. I mean, I think you see that with really orthodox Marxists and in sort of insistence on range of in terms of why why capitalism is simply about to inevitably crumble. Any amount of empirical evidence to the contrary, because they have a really strong interpretation and a really good pattern recognition. See it, I think. 9/11 truthers. I mean, any number of causes of it can just lead to perhaps unproductive paths. But some of those groups are still being critical and critical of the sort of norm, and are, I think, well, if nothing else, a level of suspicion of authority. And the stock answer and the mainstream answer is more likely to be useful than not, or at least more is if you have to have a sort of stock accepting or stock cynical distrusting standpoint. I think the latter is probably more useful.
Yeah, I would agree. Should always be skeptical.
I agree with
Yeah.
that.
Even of what I just said.
Yeah, and
I know I am.
and even of teachers and within the teaching space, so that that's what I think what becomes like hardest. But if we're doing our jobs effectively as historians, then even relating to people who know less than us about this particular subject of the course, we should still, I think, risk making ourselves vulnerable or moving into areas or discussions where we are more ignorant and risk the possibility of having our, in terms of authority or credibility undermined.
That's interesting. Yeah, I would love to do that. I would love to have the confidence to do that, and herein lies the problem. I mean, that is the problem, is not having the confidence to know exactly what's going to happen next week. So your, interpretation of whatever it is that you're talking about, I just feel like that I would really be putting myself out there. And everybody has, from their own, like, if they don't have any objectivity, everyone has the tendency to generalize or make it too personal or bias. I have no problem going out and being active politically or anything like that. But I wouldn't go out and be active politically and say that I'm doing it as a historian. I would go out and say that I'm doing it as Monica.
Yeah, and I don't want to either oversell this or prescribe particular things or make it seem as an all or nothing approach, since I think it really isn't. I mean, it all becomes in terms of a relative standpoint of what to do and what are comfortable with and what I think is useful, pushing own comfort zone and expectations a bit more. January of 2011, some of our colleagues in MGA and actually also in the history department wrote up a statement to suggest to TAs to read at the start of the semester to all their discussion sections, simply saying, Scott Walker has recently been elected, believe he is going to be devastating for the state of Wisconsin for these sort of reasons. If you see me out in terms of holding a banner against it, this is the reason why. And at that point, I mean, I honestly, in terms of struggled somewhat with it and was hesitant and particularly really uncertain the first time in terms of doing this, but in the end was able to do it, and it was 40 seconds out of the intro each time.
I think that's perfectly fine. I mean, you know my position from last discussion. I think that's perfectly fine. The thing that I would avoid personally, that I try to avoid, is if it were the Scott Walker thing. Well, I explained how I handled it in the past. I'm uncomfortable with directing them to see only my point of view, to suggest either in a minor way or a major way that this is the right thing and they have to go toward it. They have to embrace this.
Yeah, I had an environmental history course last semester, and some of the books that we were reading were really good and had a lot of obviously different really good environmental facts and scenarios where for instance industry had caused a particular disease downstream in a community downstream from the industry, and it was scientifically linked to this. And at the beginning of the semester, I couldn't understand, I couldn't wrap my head around why environmental historians couldn't consider themselves also environmentalists. And I said, well, with all this really great information, they should be out there, actively, pursuing an environmentalist ideology. They should be putting that out there. They should be showing the public. And by the end of the semester, I ultimately realized, through the help of my professor, Ben Johnson, that those ideas lose force if they are too mired by personal bias. And they cannot be taken seriously by particularly maybe environmental, other environmental historians or other historians, social historians, if you're doing social history or economic history or whatever. If you're too close to the subject, it doesn't have the same force.
Yeah, potentially in some cases. I think that being an activist generally one of the first things they have to understand, which a lot of activists don't, is using the space that you're in and using it effectively. So when it makes sense to be, shouting chants, when it makes sense to have in terms of a sign that you're doing it, and when it makes sense to give a 20-minute explanation or a informal in terms of discussion, where you actually can explain and run through and deal a lot with more of the nuance of it. Although I think the thing that makes the, in terms of environmentalist distinction a bit different than Scott Walker, Wisconsin, for instance, is the latter case. We're talking largely about like the position of teachers, the role of labor, the role of organized labor, the dignity or lack thereof. At that point, it seems that there's not a way to do that without bringing it into conditions of work directly. I mean, I think that environmentalism even becomes even more arguably crucial given sort of the timeline we're on with that. It's making its claims for being objective and being somewhat detached and like looking back and saying this shouldn't be a matter of partisan politics or ideology. It should be a matter of looking in and recognizing that we're in severe danger because of the things that we have done to this planet and the things that we are continuing to do. With a labor, you're making an argument about how workers should be treated. At that point, I think the objectivity in some cases is countereffective because it leads to a stance of let's sit back and let's be neutral. I think these things are doing terrible, but on the other hand, I'm going to keep my work experience separate and maintain kind of the sanctity of that and like the regular standard operating procedure and not compromise that by my own what might happen to my job next year. And I think that's countereffective. I think that there's a value, a historical, political value in getting passionate, in getting disruptive about the normal run-through.
But it also might be reactionary, just in the sense that it does seem time sensitive. From your position, you're saying that you would use the classroom as a space to talk about politics from your particular political stance. And with what's happening with Scott Walker, that would have been only two classrooms for me, two different classrooms for me. And in that space of time, I don't think I've come, I have a political position, but I think that it would have absolutely, because I had those classes, running parallel to the time that everything was happening with Scott Walker, it would have been so reactionary of me. I couldn't remove myself emotionally from what was happening in order to teach it effectively.
I think there's issues and hesitancy with that, but I would say.
But I think we just have a different opinion.
And also, I would just say, I don't by any means, I don't think that the classroom becomes the ideal in terms of space or the best area to bring in politics. There's other things that I think have been done more important and more substantial and better suited to environment. But I think it's a space that exists, and that depending on the issue, it makes sense to use the areas that we have, the resources, the possibility for communication, to, among other things, I don't view it as even sacrificing teaching, to center on, one of the more pressing and high-profile and dramatic, labor capital struggles that have happened in recent memory. If anything else, we do know that the history, the historians of the future are going to talk about Wisconsin and what happened and didn't happen. Mm-hmm. So bringing some of that into the classroom moment does feel pertinent.
But I want to ask you an epistemological question. Your position on being active in the classroom in this case seems to be this is so obviously right that I have the moral force or the moral justification to teach this to them. Doesn't that assume that there are no other explanatory narratives for the situation, that economics and the role of unions and labor and the infrastructure of law is that simple? You seem there seems to be an assumption of religious certitude there, and I think one of the reasons why I shoot for this objectivity is because things are so complicated. I think my positions that I have come from what I think are decent arguments that push me in that direction, but I never would say that. And I said like last time, foreign policy, totally against the Iraq War, but I can't condemn someone who's for it because I know it's complicated.
Well, it's probably relates to what I said before, but I think being willing to step into the more pertinent issues means showing a level of vulnerability and admitting to that I don't have a MA degree in the politics of Walker, or even American labor history more generally. Like, my knowledge becomes 19th century Britain. I simply know from what I've, in terms of lived and experienced more directly, which is a very different kind of experience, and it doesn't lend itself to the scholastic authority and pseudo objectivity that is said to exist. But I think it still becomes a teachable moment regardless. I still think it becomes something that's useful to engage with and present in dialogue.
Agreed there. My concern is with taking a certain position. And don't you risk, if you do it too intensely, don't you risk of presenting the class with I'm right, they're stupid and evil? Because if they're that wrong, one has to assume that the average Scott Walker supporter is stupid and or evil, which is certainly not the case. There's so many different reasons why people glom onto their politics. It's so irrational, as we know. I know lots of Scott Walker supporters, and they're neither stupid nor evil. So it's hard for me to present a reality to students that would suggest this is so obviously correct, and that gives me religious and ethical certitude, and therefore everyone else has to be so misguided or the enemy.
Yeah. I mean,
that's a Glenn Beck. That's a Glenn Beck position.
Agree.
Correction, and Scott Walker supporters are kind of stupid. I'm sorry. Go on.
That was Monica.
And
let the calls come in.
And I agree that respect the sort of standpoint of not wanting to run through with that. And I don't feel that dealing with narratives of villainy and heroism is useful in any case. I'm not, and was never at any point about lauding trade unionism as perfect absolute, or in terms of or certainly or taking Democratic standpoint as being Democratic Party as the courageous heroes of it, and simply in Republicans. I think that being a more thoughtful, involved things that needs to be going more complex than that.
I can't imagine that you do that in your classroom, but my concern is if one does it enough, do they send the message to the student that this is a black and white issue, and therefore I'm right and they're either stupid or evil or worse, both? The idea that again, both sides. It's not that there's the old cliche that there's two sides to every story. It's not that. It's that both run on their own logic, and the logic that comes from the right. The way they perceive economics, the way they think it works, is very different from how the left thinks about economics and things like that. So, and that's where we get into this whole thing with the right calling the left communists and the left calling the right fascists, because neither one is any of those things, because it's ultimately what they want. And in most cases, the right and the left want very similar things. They just want it in different ways.
I agree.
In a fair number of cases, although I think, it does, it goes into too much into the one-liner response, but in some cases, in terms of right becomes fascist or close enough to fascist to draw up the comparisons where they exist and take that seriously. But I guess the larger point, which have just some sort of assumptions that are different on this, is I think that we have one job to give with this. We have one self ultimately to be teaching with this, so that I think that as much as there becomes the risk and the and just the danger of including of oversimplifying or simply presenting kind of stock answers, I still think there's more value, or in some cases, there's more risk of not doing that. In some cases, I think throughout this, there's ways of things that are crucial that it would be possible to present and sort of give in a way that gives sort of different viewpoints, a lot of things are happening in Wisconsin now. Some people are saying this, other people are saying, this. What do you think, and then do it in a way that might have interesting debate, but that would still, leave the students like wondering where their TA stood on this, which I think would have value and has usefulness, but also I think it's worthwhile to kind of like tear down some of the facade of this issue and to say that I'm not actually neutral in this because it's education, it's teaching that is directly involved and that is directly being threatened in this way. And I think doing it in a way that is, I think, genuinely sort of, humble. That does show the, the risk of like, this is just sort of me. This is based on other kind of experiences. A lot of things I don't know. I don't, of course, don't have the context or objectivity for this, but still saying it regardless as a laborer.
I can appreciate your desire to do that, and maybe it isn't such a bad idea. I mean, for me, I'll maintain my standpoint in that I don't feel comfortable doing that. But I think for me, more than anything, I'd love to figure out a way to reach people in Wisconsin, if we're talking about the Scott Walker issue, who aren't college students, who might not understand the implications of the way that they're voting, because it seems like so many people vote against their own socioeconomic status in society. So, as historians or those who might be able to clarify certain situations because of our, research or just our experience, I would love to find a way to help people understand how to vote better for themselves.
Yeah. Possibly, and I mean, even like, abstracted, a little bit. I think there's other issues that are brought up with this, that sometimes neutrality and I think working too hard to create, like safe space for the more conservative or reactionary students doesn't do a real service to our students or to, or to history as a whole. I mean, women, gender, feminism, it would certainly be possible to talk about context of recent history and say that some people are, in favor of in terms of feminism, other people think it's, that feminists are going too far or are doing in terms of better. It still becomes a politically charged, politicized environment. But in that context, I don't think it would be
certainly the their lines are blurry, but this never applies to issues that involved human rights or human dignity. Those are always the values. So the civil rights, all those things, people gaining freedom is one of those things that is it's an American value. It's something that I don't think is certainly there's a right or left approach to this, but it's never that. It's always the complicated economic issues. It's the complicated foreign policy issues. Well, people should always advocate for human rights in that sense. But can I ask, well, how would you feel if a Scott Walker supporter was advocating for Scott Walker in his or her classroom? Would that be okay? Is that morally okay, ethically okay?
I would think that, it would not. I don't think a Scott Walker supporter could say that they were under, in terms of that they were being had the existential crisis aimed. If they were in favor of budget, the budget shifts and taking away unions.
But now with the recall.
They're not being targeted in the same way.
What's that?
They're not being targeted directly. It's not analogous. It's not going directly after their pensions and jobs or unions or political party. I suppose you could, a sufficiently conservative figure could, argue that the recall is seeking to, cut out GOP and, impose, sort of tyranny of the unions and, liberal corruption and statist response. But I think that would be a profound misinterpretation. I think that the substance of the ground doesn't justify.
I think if you talk to a very, very engaged Scott Walker supporter, I think you would probably find some existential crisis there. There's a sophisticated argument on their side for this the role of labor and unions and economics and all that stuff. So I want to be on the a humble side and say this is very complicated, so I need to let them sort it out for themselves. Let them, as long as they have the tools to think through these things, that's what I feel my burden is. But
possibly, though I guess as I said before, I mean I'm postmodern, but not so postmodern that I'm going to throw away some of material realities and like facts on the ground involving that, which I think does in this case make it a different. I mean, it makes it a very different thing to be teaching like against war or against sexism, against homophobia, against union busting, in a way that agitating for the other side of it is not the same. That ultimately, one group that class inequality and racial, gender, etc., inequality in country being what it is the sides aren't equal. One is more dominant, so agitating for one is not the same as the other.
But again, I just want to go back to my assertion that the what is really important, I think college students are going to determine once they hopefully they're voting, but once they get out of college and establish a home and get a car or have a family, they're going to determine which way they're going to vote and which side of the political divide they'll be on. I'm really concerned with the people in Wisconsin who, for no socioeconomic reason, like I was saying before, should be voting for Scott Walker. Those are the people I think that I would love to reach out to, because I feel like they have no historical understanding of the labor movement as you're talking about. There are people from the county that I grew up in, Dodge County, which is predominantly farmers and factory workers, who should be depending on, especially the factory workers, unions to make sure that they have health care, unions to make sure that they have workman's comp, or that they don't have to work Saturday and Sunday, and all of the things that go along with the labor movement. So why is it that somewhere like Dodge County, that is predominantly rural, industrial, and has a good amount of farmers, votes overtly Republican?
Yeah, I mean, probably I'd say that from that. I mean, it's a mistake to expect too much change of electoral politics more broadly. But I'd also say that because it's a matter of inequality and power, so that each time, I mean, every push of the left has to be an intervention in and against power code. It has to be some level disruptive, and that's what unions meant initially when the concept was, first emerged. It was challenging, confrontational, and very dangerous. And I think if unions are to be more relevant than they have been in the past, they have to be introduced and talked about and agitated for in areas where there is uncertainty and sort of danger and risk involved.
This was a
we're closing down.
Quickly before we go, I want to be absolutely clear that I very much dislike Scott Walker. I'm very, very pro-union. So I just want to make sure that people don't I was playing devil's advocate.
Sure, but no, if we want to mimic the role of the left, we should have incredible antagonisms and go off and form 5 different separate ideologies that hate each other, thus modeling how the left tends to deal with situations of crisis and adversity. In any case, I think that's about all for tonight. Interest of time, we will have a few closing notes from our song Life of the Mind, and then hope to again join us, tune in next week.
Thank you.
Another good show, Jacob.